Hey there, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, I want you to imagine that I'm your local guide, taking you on this incredibly vivid journey to a place where the raw, violent forces of the earth crash right into one of the most fascinating human stories ever recorded. We're heading to Þingvellir National Park in Iceland. Over the next few minutes, we're going to explore a society built from absolute scratch by outcasts, a society governed by an open-air parliament sitting right on top of a tectonic fault line. Okay. Let's dive into this. What actually happens when you build a society from scratch on a tearing tectonic fault? To really understand Iceland, you have to instantly merge its brutal geology with a desperate human survival story. You see, the people who settled this land didn't just have to figure out how to govern themselves, they had to do it on a landscape that is quite literally tearing itself apart. And when I say tearing apart, I mean that literally. 2.5 centimeters. That is the exact rate the tectonic plates rip apart every single year right beneath your feet at Thingvellir. Now, I know that might not sound like much, but over millennia, this process, which geologists call rifting, has carved out a dramatic, chaotic landscape of deep fissures, sunken valleys, and sheer cliffs. You are standing directly on the mid-Atlantic ridge. It's one of the only places on the entire planet where this massive underwater mountain range actually breaches the ocean's surface. I want you to picture this. Imagine walking directly between two towering walls of solid rock. On one side of you is the North American plate. On the exact opposite side, the Eurasian plate. When you step down into this rift valley, you are physically walking in the space between two continents. It's an absolutely breathtaking, humbling experience that just visually smashes you with the immense forces shaping the Earth's crust. All of this geological violence birthed two wildly dramatic features. First up is the Sulfur Fissure. It's filled with glacial meltwater that's been filtering underground for decades. It's freezing, a constant 2 degrees Celsius, but the underwater visibility is unbelievable, stretching over 100 meters. Second is the Almannagjá gorge, with its massive, towering basalt cliffs. And as we're about to see, the incredible acoustic properties of those giant rock walls are going to become absolutely crucial to the human side of our story. So let's meet the people who actually arrived in this brutal landscape. We call this era landnám, or the settlement epoch. Starting around 874 AD, you had this massive wave of outcasts, political dissidents, and Viking noblemen fleeing the tyrannical rule of King Harald Fairhair over in Norway. But they didn't come alone. This initial population of over 4,000 people included Gaelic captives taken from raids in Ireland and Scotland, brought over as enslaved household members. Together, this incredibly complex mix of people had to somehow build a new life at the very edge of the known world. And this brilliantly illustrates the wild political system they created. Because they were running away from an absolute monarch, they designed a society with no king, no military, no executive branch, and get this, no public police force. It was essentially a stateless commonwealth. It's a completely extraordinary experiment in constitutional design. Basically, if you were wronged, it was entirely up to you and your allies to enforce the law and extract compensation. But obviously, a society still needs rules, right? Which brings us to the Althing. Established in 930 AD, this was an open-air national assembly, and it's widely considered the oldest existing parliament in the world. For 2 weeks every June, the entire island would converge at Thingvellir. They'd set up temporary camps, trade goods, arrange marriages, and most importantly, settle their bloodiest disputes and pass national legislation. So if there was no king, who was actually in charge? Well, power was distributed among 39 elite chieftains, known as the Goði. They made up the legislative council. But what's really fascinating here is that a chieftaincy wasn't just a piece of land. It was a conceptual, abstract commodity. You could buy it, sell it, or trade it. In a society entirely dependent on strict rules and shifting alliances, rather than a central army, these chieftains were literally the glue holding the Commonwealth together. Now remember those massive basalt cliffs we talked about a minute ago? Let's bring your attention to the Logberg, or the Law Rock. This was the absolute focal point of the Althing, perched right on the edge of the Almannagjá fault line. Because they didn't have written laws at first, an elected official called the Lawspeaker had to recite the entire legal code from memory over a 3-year term. He'd stand right at this rock, and the natural acoustics of the tectonic cliff face behind him amplified and projected his voice out to the massive crowds gathered in the valley below. The landscape itself literally facilitated their democracy. For decades, this crazy system actually works, but as we trace their history toward the end of the 10th century, a terrifying crisis starts brewing. The Norwegian king, Olaf Tryggvason, absolutely demands that Iceland convert to Christianity. To force their hand, he closes Norwegian ports, takes Icelandic hostages, and literally threatens to execute pagans. By the summer of the year 1000, the two factions arrive at the Althing, flat out refusing to share the same laws. The Commonwealth is teetering on the razor's edge of a full-blown, bloody civil war. So the crucial question becomes, how on earth do you stop a religious civil war when you literally have no army to enforce the peace and no king to dictate a ruling? Suddenly, the society's greatest feature, its statelessness, became its most glaring existential vulnerability. The answer to that question gives us one of the most intense, cinematic micro-narratives in all of history. The Christian and pagan factions finally agreed to submit the ultimate decision to one single arbitrator, Thorgeir, the current Lawspeaker, who just so happened to be a pagan priest himself. Knowing the fate of the entire nation rested squarely on his shoulders, Thorgeir retreated to his camp, lay down, and pulled a heavy fur cloak over his head. For a full day and a full night, he rested there in silent meditation. He completely isolated himself in this tense, thriller-like atmosphere, desperately trying to find a way to save his people from a slaughter. When he finally emerged, he delivered what's known as the Fur Cloak Compromise. Step 1. To prevent war and appease Norway, Iceland would adopt one law and one religion. Christianity officially became the national faith. But here is the incredibly pragmatic concession. Thorgeir ruled that paganism could still be practiced as long as it was done strictly in private. It was a profound, face-saving compromise that unified the public law while brilliantly, cleverly dodging bloodshed. While Thorgeir miraculously saved the Commonwealth in the year 1000, the system couldn't last forever. Fast forward to the 13th century, an era known as the Age of the Sturlungs, and the brilliant stateless design really begins to crack under the pressure. Wealth and power started concentrating into the hands of just a few massive clans, triggering incredibly violent civil wars. Exhausted by the constant bloodshed and heavily squeezed by Norwegian royal pressure and trade blockades, the chieftains finally threw in the towel. In 1262, they signed the Old Covenant, officially submitting to the King of Norway and bringing the radical experiment of the Free State to a tragic end. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the people living through that violent 13th century looked back at their own past. I'm sure you've heard of the famous Icelandic sagas, those epic tales of blood feuds and heroism. But as this quote reminds us, the author of Njáls saga was absolutely not trying to write an objective history. The characters were real people, sure, but the stories were deeply, deeply shaped by the turbulent times in which they were written. Seriously, consider how these sagas functioned on the ground as political tools. Desperate 13th century chieftains actually sponsored the writing of these stories during their civil wars. They essentially weaponized the legendary tales of their 10th century ancestors to legitimize their modern territorial claims and justify their violent power grabs. They were romanticizing this lost golden age of equality and justice, even as they themselves were tearing that exact society to pieces. The sagas aren't just dry history, they are living, breathing political propaganda from a society in total collapse. Which brings us to our final thought for today. When you finally make that incredible trip to Iceland and you stand on the Logberg looking up at those massive tectonic cliffs, what are you going to see? Are you just going to see some ancient basalt rock? Or will you feel the absolute weight of the fiery crucible of a radical democracy? These were real people, outcasts who defied kings, solving literal life or death problems in a breathtaking, brutal landscape. I really hope this explainer helps you feel the true historical weight of the ground you'll be standing on. Thanks so much for joining me, and keep learning.